I got distracted by Animal Crossing. You know how it is. But today we are on chapter 31, and that one is called Then Came a Scream. In the last chapter, Emrys and Shim met an old couple named Tillian and Garlatha, and they had a beautiful orchard that was run with love. So they were very lovely characters, and so we're onward to try to save Rhea. Okay, so for several hours we trekked toward the notch in the ridge, my staff rhythmically punching the dry soil and dead grass. A cold wind out of the dark hills blew down on us. Its bitter gusts slapped our faces. Despite the wind, Shim did his best to stay by my side. Even so, I had to stop several times to help him through some thorny bracken or up a steep pitch. As the land sloped increasingly upward, the wind blew over ever more fiercely. Soon it smacked with such piercing cold that my hand holding my staff no longer pulsed with pain, but started to go numb. It felt as wooden as the staff itself. Flying bits of ice began to whip against us. I lifted my free arm to protect my cheeks and sightless eyes. The bits of ice turned into needles, then shards, then daggers. As the icy blades rained down on us, Shim, who had resisted complaining since leaving the garden, whined piteously. But I could only hear him in the lulls between gusts, for the howling of the wind grew fiercer. Although it remained light enough for my second sight to help, the swirling ice and blowing dirt confused my sense of direction. Suddenly I stumbled against a low, flat outcropping of some sort. With a cry, I crumbled to the ground, dropping my staff. Shivering, I crawled out over to the outcropping, hoping to use it as a slight shelter against the storm. Shim tucked himself into the folds of my tunic. We sat there, our teeth chattering from the cold, for minutes that seemed like weeks. In time, the ice storm abated. The howling wind hurled itself at us a few last times, then finally retreated. Although the air seemed no warmer, our body slowly revived. I opened and closed my hands, which made my palms and fingertips sting. Hesitantly, Shim poked his head out of my tunic, his wild hair embedded with icicles. All at once, I realized that the outcropping that had partially shielded us was nothing more than an immense tree stump. All around us, thousands of such stumps littered the hills, separated by a vast web of eroded gullies. Though frosted with glaze of ice, the stumps did not sparkle or gleam. They merely sat there, as lifeless as burial mounds. In a flash, I understood. This was all that remained of the vast forest that Talayan had described. Stangmar's armies have sown death across the land. The old man's words lifted like ghosts of the rotting stumps, the blood-red soil, the broken hills. Shim and I looked at each other. Without a word, we stood up on the frosted ground. I picked up my staff, knocking a chunk of ice off the top. Then I located the notch again, stepped over the brittle remains of a branch, and started up the slippery terrain. Shim scrambled to stay with me, muttering under his breath. As the day wore on, we continued to climb, over hills scarred with countless stumps and dry stream beds. All the while, the sky grew darker. Soon the notch disappeared, swallowed in the deepening darkness. I could only trust my memory of where I had last glimpsed its two sharp knobs, though that memory itself was fading with the light. Slowly we gained elevation. Despite the dim light, I detected a few thin trees rising amidst the stumps and dead branches. Their twisted forms resembled people writhing in pain. Seeing one tree wearing the bark of a beech, I approached it. Laying my hand on the trunk, I made the swishing, rustling sound that Rhea had taught me in Druma Wood. I tried again. This time, I made the swishes, imagined the living, breathing presence of a healthy tree before me. The powerful roots thrusting into the soil, the arching branches lifting toward the sky, the deep-throated song rising through the trunk, thrilling each and every leaf. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but I thought I could sense the barest beginnings of a quiver in the uppermost branches. Yet if they had actually moved, they quickly fell still again. Giving up, I trudged on. Shim huffed at my heels. As we climbed the rising slope, the ground grew more rocky. With each passing minute, the light dimmed further. The sky blackened, while the stumps and rocks around us melted into shadows. Although my second sight was swiftly fading, I fought to see whatever I still could, and with all my concentration I listened. I knew that any movement, no matter how slight, could provide our only warning of attack. As I tried to avoid tripping on rocks and snapping dead branches, my steps grew less certain. Ahead, I discerned a barely visible gap, where twin knobs of dark rock lifted into the still darker sky. Might it be the notch? I edged closer, as quietly as I could. Abruptly, I stopped. I stood as still as one of the twisted trees, listening. Shim crept to my side. "You hear something?" "Not sure," I whispered. "I thought I did. Somewhere ahead of us." Minutes passed. I heard no sound apart from our breathing and the thumping of my own heart. Eventually, I touched the little giant's arm. "Let's go," I whispered, "but keep quiet. Goblins are near." "Oh," moaned Shim. "I is scared. Certainly, definitely, Quiet!" Out of the shadows ahead of us came a raspy cry and a sudden pounding of feet. Torches flared, searing the darkness. "Goblins!" Across the rocky ridge we fled. Dead branches snapped under our feet. Thorns ripped at our shins. I could hear, just behind, the heaving of the goblins' chests, the clanking of their armor, the sputtering of their torches. Shim and I tore across the rocks, trying not to stumble. Darkness pressed closer. We did not know where we were going, nor did we care. We only knew that the goblins were gaining on us. In a desperate effort to lose them, I veered sharply to one side. Shim followed closely, and we crossed over the ridge. The vista before us could not have been more chilling. Against the darkened sky, more hills loomed even darker. Worse yet, the valley below us looked utterly black, but for the glint of hundreds of tiny lights. Despite the goblins at our backs, we hesitated for an instant. A spear whizzed past, passing between my head and the top of my staff. Even as the spear clattered against the ground, to a chorus of raspy curses, we plunged down the slope. My foot struck a rock and I fell, sprawling. Shim waited long enough for me to roll back to my feet, grab my staff, and resume running. We charged downward into the black valley. Total darkness swept over us like a wave. The ground became wet and mushy under our feet. The air turned rancid. Before long, we splashed through something like an enormous puddle, covering a bed of oozing muck. All at once I halted, causing Shim to run straight into my back. What is you stopping for?" he demanded angrily. "Listen." "I hears nothing except for the throbbings of my tenderly nose." "That's just it. The goblins stopped. Somewhere back there." "You was right." The little giant shifted nervously in the murk. "Do you think they scared to goes here?" I felt something cold oozing into my leather boots. "We may be in the haunted marsh." As if in answer, a faint, wavering light appeared some distance away. It hovered in the darkness, seeming to examine us. Then another appeared, followed by another. Soon more than 20 of the eerie lights swam around us, moving slowly closer. Shim squeezed my hand. A reeking smell, like festering flesh, drifted over us. I gagged, my lungs rebelling. As the lights drew nearer, the smell grew stronger. Then came a thin, unsteady wailing, an ancient dirge pulsing with anguish, with undying pain. The wailing made me cringe as it welled out of the ground, the lights, the rotting air. It came from one side. It came from the other. It came from every direction at once. Shim released a terrified shriek. Letting go of my hand, he dashed away from the cluster of floating lights. "Wait!" I hurled myself after him. I had only gone a few steps, however, when something caught my foot. I tumbled headlong into a puddle of slimy liquid. Pulling myself and my staff free, I shook the murk from my arms. They stunk of mold and decay. The ominous lights circled, gathering again. The wailing swelled. The stench of death flooded over me. "Shim!" No answer. "Shim!" Then came a scream. The lights pressed closer, staring down on me like so many eyes. So this was how my quest would end. I would have rather drowned in the sea off the coast of Gwynedd than die like this, wretched and alone. Yet the loss of my own quest pained me less than the loss of Rhea. She, like the brave Merlin, had given her life for me. I did not deserve such friendship. Yet she did not deserve to die. She was so full of life, so full of wisdom that I did not begin to comprehend. The pain of losing her made my heart sting as if it were on fire. Suddenly I realized that the Galator was blazing with heat against my chest. I tore it out of my tunic and held it high. The jeweled center sparkled with its own green light, pushing back the darkness just enough that I could see my own arm and hand. The eerie lights faltered, stopping their advance. The wailing ceased. A touch of freshness wafted in the air. At the same time, the Galator's glow started to expand. In a few seconds, the circle of green illuminated my entire body as well as my staff. "Shim, where are you?" "Here." Soaked in murk, he staggered to my side. His chest, legs, arm, and one side of his face dripped with black ooze. As the glowing circle expanded, the floating lights wavered, then slowly drew back into the darkness. The wailing resumed, but transformed into an angry murmur. Heartened by the retreat of the lights, I pressed ahead. I would find some way out of this swamp, whatever it took. Holding the Galator above my head with one hand, grasping my staff with the other, I made sure Shim held tight to my tunic. Then I started to trudge through the marshy pools. The mud was soft and sticky, sucking at my boots. Suddenly I stepped into a shallow pit. I fell forward with a splash, almost dropping the pendant. Instantly, the eyes of light crowded closer and the murmur swelled louder. As I regained my balance, the menacing lights pulled back a little. It took me a moment to extract my staff from the grasping mud of the pit, though it finally came free with a loud slurp. We slogged onward. I could tell, however, that Shim could not travel very far in this terrain. Although he was struggling to stay with me, the water was up to his waist, and the work of pushing through it was tiring him fast. My own legs, as well as the arm holding the Galator, began to feel increasingly heavy. Nevertheless, I helped Shim climb up to the shoulder of my arm holding the staff. It was the same shoulder that Trouble had once claimed as his perch, but this load felt much heavier than the hawk ever did. Each step grew more difficult, each breath more labored. I felt weaker and weaker, as if the marsh itself was sapping my strength. My shoulder ached. The murk from Shim's leg dripped onto my face, while the rancid taste burned my tongue. As my stamina faded, the lights pressed ever closer. The murmur swelled like a pack of wolves howling in my ears. The marsh seemed endless, stretching far beyond the limits of my flagging endurance. My powers, should I try to use them? I needed them so much, yet I feared them so much. The flames rose again in my mind, snapping at my face, searing my flesh, scorching my eyes. Suddenly I stumbled. I fell to my knees, barely hanging on to both my staff and the Galator. Shim gave a shout and clung to my neck, sobbing. Again the lights crowded around, waiting to see if I would rise again. With all my remaining strength, I pushed myself out of the slime. I tried to lift the Galator, but could not bring it any higher than my chest. I took another exhausted step and stumbled again. I heard the Galator smack against something hard, like stone. I heard Shim scream as the murmur grew almost deafening. Then I heard no more. Oof, so that is the end of chapter 31. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 32 called Dark Fate. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll start reading at 9 p.m. Pacific time. Bye.